Good evening. On behalf of the Religion and Public Life program at Rice University, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event. I'm Didi. I'm a senior graduate student fellow of the Religion and Public Life program. I have the privilege of introducing the two speakers tonight. Michael Emerson is provost of North Park University, where he also serves as professor of sociology and urban studies. Michael has been studying religion, race, and their impacts on urban life for the past 30 years. Some of you may recall that Michael was a professor in the sociology department at Rice until leaving in 2015. We are thrilled to have him on campus and are honored that he has chosen to spend the time with us tonight. Fenggang is professor of sociology at Purdue University. He founded and currently directs the Center on Religion and Chinese Society at Purdue. The center's mission is to advance the social scientific study of religion in Chinese societies and among the Chinese in diasporas. And in 2014, Fenggang launched a journal called The Review of Religion in the Chinese Society. I'd also like to introduce the moderator of tonight's event, Elaine Howard-Auckland. Elaine is the founding director of the Religion and Public Life program. She is also the Herbert S. Audrey Chair in Social Sciences and a professor of sociology at Rice. Please look to your program for additional biographical information. If it is not obvious already, both of our panelists are well equipped to speak on tonight's topic. For more information about the event sponsor, the Religion and Public Life program, please visit our website at rplp.rice.edu. RPLP here stands for Religion and Public Life program. And please join our next panel conversation, Religion and Social Media. Is there an app for that? The next event will be Monday, March the 19th at 7 p.m. in this room. Our panelists will address how media technologies have affected the way people practice religion and how religion has affected the way people use technologies, if at all. Tonight's conversation is titled Public Religion from West to East. According to the Pew Research Center, while 71% of Americans identify with a Christian faith, nearly 6% identify with a non-Christian faith. This breaks down to 0.7 Buddhists, 0.7 Hindus, and 0.3 other world religions. According to the World Atlas Online, 61% of people in China are strict atheists. 26% adheres to Taoist or Confucian philosophies. 6% are Buddhists, 2% are Christians, 2% adhere to folk religions, and 2% are Muslims. The religious landscape of the US and mainland China are different. Even though people in these two countries may be affiliated to same traditional faiths, such as Buddhism or Christianity, their understandings of religiosity may be different, according to the national and the social context where they practice their faith. As we see religion impact people's public lives in the US and China, the West and the East, we observe different types of religiosity shared in distinctive public spheres. Before we go into tonight's discussion about public religion from West to East, we want to thank to the team of the Religion and Public Life program, especially Haley Hemstreet, the program manager, who made great effort to make tonight's event happen. Allow me to explain the flow of this evening. Michael and Fenggang will give short speeches about public religion from West to East. Then Elaine will lead in-depth conversation with the panelists. Finally, there will be some time for questions from you, the audience. Please join the panelists and the moderator for a reception in the foyer following the formal event. Now, please join me in welcoming our panelists for their brief opening remarks. First, Michael Emerson, followed by Fenggang. Thank you.
Well, glad to see you. Welcome. So they said I had 5 minutes to talk about American religion, and I thought, you know, the only thing more challenging would be 5 minutes to talk about Chinese religion. So I'm counting my blessings. Let me just say basically 2 sentences that summarize the current state of American religion. A little bit later, we'll talk about the changes that have happened in the last 40 years or so here in the U.S. compared to China. So by any standard, the U.S. is a highly religious society, especially when you consider it compared to other highly economically developed societies. Perhaps the only rival would be Ireland. More than 9 out of 10 Americans say they believe in a God. 86% say they believe in heaven. 73% believe in hell. I always think that's convenient. More believe in heaven, less in hell. But a majority pray. A third or more attend religious services every week, and the majority of Americans attend at least a few times a year. What I want to focus on in particular, though, is influences in American religion that Asians and Asian Americans have brought. So obviously, it's contributed substantially to the diversity that we have in our American religion, not always in terms of massive size, but certainly in our cities we will see quite a bit of this. So Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Sikhism, Jainism, Taoism, and so on, Japanese religions, others, come to us because of Asian immigration. So we'll see mosques, we'll see temples, and other houses of worship that aren't churches or synagogues in every city of the U.S. What I find interesting is that increasingly we'll see them in small towns and rural areas as well, something that wouldn't have been happening not that long ago. We're getting schools founded by different religions in the U.S., again, fairly new, from preschool to universities. You may not know this, but there are 10 Buddhist universities in the United States, all very new. For example, Soka University of America, that's in California, may be the largest of the Buddhist universities. And Asians and Asian Americans have had substantial influence on Christianity here. And there's been quite a bit of work on that, from immigrant churches to diversifying pre-existing congregations to having a significant presence in our seminaries, parachurch organizations, and denominational leadership. 13% of all seminarians in Catholic seminary are Asian or Asian American. Even larger in evangelical seminary. So, for example, currently the largest evangelical seminary in the U.S. is Fuller Seminary out in California, and 20% of all of their students are Asian or Asian American, and that's fairly common percentage. In the U.S., the Asians that are here, the Asian Americans, break down this way. The largest group, though not the majority, are Christian, 42%. When asked, say that they are of a Christian faith. A quarter say they're unaffiliated, which is much, much, much higher than the U.S. population. 14% say they are Buddhist, 10% Hindu. And this varies dramatically by the country of origin where they've come from. So Filipino Americans are majority Catholic. Korean Americans are majority Protestant. Or a little bit over half of all Indian Americans are Hindu. Vietnamese Americans most likely are to be Buddhist. So it does depend, because we are talking about such a vast part of the world. Even Asian American evangelical Protestants, when we look at Koreans in particular, if you're looking for maybe the most religious group in the United States, currently that would be Korean Americans. Where I said about a third or a little bit more than a third of Americans are worshiping each week. 76% of Korean Americans are worshiping each week in church. So there's quite a bit of variation. My 5 minutes up. I'm going to turn it over to my good friend Fenggang.
Good evening. Yeah, I have my 5 minutes. And, you know, I think about religion in China. I want to begin the difference between the US and China. Michael already talked about gave a general picture of religion in the US. There cannot be more different between China and the US in terms of religion. Actually, China and the US are always on the opposite. Now here is the evening. China is in the early morning. And we see good evening. In China, you would see evening good, right? 晚上好. So they're so different. In religion, of course, more than 90% Americans say they believe in God. Then you have vast majority of the Chinese claim to be atheist. You cannot be more different than that, right? The US and China. But I want to say, actually the difference is only in appearance. It may not be as stark contrast as many people think. China was once the most secular country in the world, more secular than the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, in the harshest time of suppression, there were several hundred churches of Orthodox Christianity remained open for religious services. But in China, from 1966 to 1979, there was no church was open, no Buddhist temple or Taoist temple open, no mosque was open for religious services. Zero. There was only another country matched China. That was not the Soviet Union. It was Albania. In fact, the Albania leader visited China, learned that China was going to close down all religious sites, and he rushed back and did that first. It's a competition. And it lasted longer, the ban in Albania. And then we know what happened in 1990. But China began to change in 1979. I said, you know, this banning of religion didn't work because during the ban of religions, the number of Catholics remained the same. Before the ban, after the ban, more than 10 years, there were 3 million Catholics before and 3 million Catholics after. And then also for Protestants, before the ban, there was 1 million Protestants. After the ban, there were 3 million. So during the ban, when there was no church open, the number of Christians increased 3 times. Right? So since 1979, the change has been fast, rapid. Even though there are still sometimes you see the numbers saying the majority of the Chinese are still atheist, like the insert in this saying, this is not true anymore. No way. And I don't know where they, you know, the data they came from. But when we did a survey, actually a Chinese survey company did a survey in 2007 in China. It's a national sample, scientific sample, with more than 7,000 cases. And based on that survey, and so far that's still the best survey of religion in China. No better survey than that one. We asked 88 questions, most of them are on religion. So we asked many questions. Our calculation is that there was no more than 15% of the Chinese can be said are pure atheists. 85% either have religious identification, but more people have religious practice or religious belief. Identity is hard in China because the official ideology is atheism. So identifying with a religion is very often dangerous. So people do not identify, but nonetheless they believe and practice. Time running up. But another point I want to make is that I mentioned this earlier already on a different occasion. by the year 2030, that's very soon, right? 12 years from now, I think there will most likely more Christians in China than in the US. We know that the US is still the #1 in terms of the number of Christians, even though in recent years there's a slight decline, but still the largest number. But in China, the growth of Christians, the number of Christians from 1980 to 2010, 30 years, the average annual growth is more than 10%. So every 100 Christians, the next year they will get 10 more. That's the rate every year for more than for 30 years. And even if the growth is slower than that, 7% per year, for example, there will be more Christians in China by 2030 than in the US. Even longer term, I said this in my presidential address a few years ago, in the long-term trend, if we look at the religious change of China and the US, I see increasing convergence than difference. And that's going to be very interesting to see, because religion has important social, economic, and political impact. Thank you.
Go look at my name tag. That's me. Okay. Thank you. That was terrific. That was really terrific. So maybe talk a little bit more, Fenggang, if I can, because it flows nicely from what you said into some of our questions. I should say the students wrote these questions, so they're going to be hard and a little bit unvarnished. You know, I would try to soft pedal them a bit, but the students tend to be tougher than me. So how have governmental policies about religion in China influenced the ways religion is actually practiced in a day-to-day? So we're thinking about, thank you, sorry, I should be talking to this. We're thinking about public religion. So how has the relationship between religion and the state in China then influenced the practice of religion? You said some really interesting things in your remarks just now about how, you know, people might officially identify as atheists but actually be practicing, and so then, you know, like World Atlas statistics on religion then become, you know, are not accurate, right, in determining how you define religion. So maybe talk with us just a little bit more about that.
How does the government influence the practice of religion? Mm-hmm. That's a very good question to start with. The government still restrict religion. The policy is clear, want to restrict and even suppress religion, religious groups, religious activities. The policy clearly say that the policy that formulated in 1982, that continued to be the foundation for the religious policy, it says that you cannot spread religion beyond the religious values. That's still the policy. But, you know, it's not practical. So the restriction is there, but it's not enforceable. People can talk about religion at home with friends, and also try hard to say about religion not with the name of religion. That is, you can say, oh, I'm doing culture. This is like a shamanism. It's not religion. It's folk culture. And you can have choir singing, kind of, you know, gospel singing. You wouldn't say this is, I'm doing religion. I'm doing singing. And so that's the restriction reduced the number who actively identify with religion and actively saying, I'm doing religion. They just do things in the name of other things. Another example is this intangible or non-material heritage. Using that expression to do folk religion, to do Taoism and Buddhism outside of the temples.
So saying this is our we're simply honoring our heritage. Okay.
So that's one of the aspects. That's how the government policy actually affected the way of practicing religion. It's not so much that they stop doing it, they just do it in the name of something else. So measuring religion in China is a big challenge.
Absolutely.
Because, yeah, people say, I'm not religious. But what do you believe? What do you practice? Then you'll find a lot of religious things.
So maybe Michael, talk to us a little bit about the U.S., and then we'll come back to bring them together. But how has U.S. religion changed over the past 50 years? That's a small question right there. That's a small question about which many books have been written. Perhaps summarize them briefly in just a few sentences for us.
Okay, I'll try. Religion has changed in multiple ways, and I'll put it into a few categories here. So we have already mentioned, in the last 40, 50 years, religion in the U.S. has become much more diverse. Many more options, many more types of ways of worshiping, even within what seems like, on the surface, the same religious tradition. So that has changed. There's another change that's sort of interesting because it's very, it's important in American U.S. life, politics, and such. There's been a decline in the percentage of Americans that believe the Bible to be inerrant, to be the literal Word of God. So in 1970, 40% said that. Today, 30% say that. So it hasn't been a huge decline. What's interesting about the decline is it all happened before the year 2000. Since then, there has been no change. In fact, it's been just a slight uptick in the percent. So something has happened that's in this century that's changing things a bit. We see a smaller percent of Americans involved in regular religious practice. And they'll often say, this way, I am spiritual but not religious. And when we interview them, what it means is, I believe, just as you're saying, but I don't believe in organized religion. That's been a lot of trust lost in organized religion. Another thing that's causing that change, and I'll compare here, 1972, if you look at just Protestants in the U.S., 27% of all Americans were classified as mainline Protestants, Episcopal, ELCA Lutheran, United Methodist, and so on, and evangelicals were 24%, so slightly more mainline. Today, mainline's gone from 27% to barely 10%, evangelicals from 24% to about 30%. Being mainline the next generation seems to have two paths. They either just leave religion altogether, or they become evangelical. It's like, it's hard to hold on across generations for mainline for whatever reason. So that causes some of the other changes that we see. Two more big changes I'll say, and that is, there's been a consolidation in the size of houses of worship. So there are about 350,000 houses of worship in the U.S. If you take the top 1% of those, the largest 1%, 20% of all Americans go to those that worship. If you take the largest 10% of congregations, currently over half of all Americans worship in that largest 10% of congregations. I always love to be in Houston because we got the nation's largest congregation just down the street. And then we have like the nation's third largest congregation just down the street. I mean, it becomes a big business. I mean, one of is it Second Baptist, where Ed Young, the senior pastor, because he has multiple campuses, they take him in a helicopter to go from one service to the other. It's the only way he can get there. He's got to preach here, get out to Katy, and so on. So that has been a huge change, this consolidation. It used to be that the average size of a congregation was under 100. Most people worshiped in smaller congregations. Just as we see big box everything, big box shopping, big box, we see the same in religion.
Big box church.
Big box church, yep.
It's a shirt.
That's right. And then one last one, and maybe we can talk about this more later. And we can see it every time we watch political elections. The connection between your religious tradition and how you vote has grown stronger and stronger and stronger since the 1960s. There was almost no relationship in the 1960s, but it has become so strong that we can, it's just, we know how the patterns go, but that's a fairly new phenomenon.
So thinking about religious change both in China and in the U.S., then how has that had an impact on religion in public life? I imagine that looks very different, but maybe not. I mean, you're already both challenging my categories some.
In China, first religion was kept private, strictly private, or the formal regulations still make that insistence. But religion keep becoming more and more public, engaging in public affairs. One of the examples is the rise of Christian lawyers in recent years. These are the lawyers who fight for civil rights and human rights of people, especially those marginalized people. And these Christians have their clear Christian identity, just they don't hide that. And they are also very, very strong in fighting for the rights of those marginalized people. This has become a phenomenon. And so religion is coming back to the public, increasingly so.
And in the US, I mean, so many of you are from here, so you know, but religion has always been in the public sphere, but I think it has become even more so. And we could talk forever about it, but what is unique is that it's become more politicized, as we mentioned. So in the last election, if you were white evangelical, over 80% voted for Trump. If you were black evangelical or Hispanic evangelical, over 80% voted for Clinton. That's the kind of involvement in the public sphere that often gets the press. But the other kinds are, because we're a society so much based on social services coming from people giving money, nonprofits, something like 3/4 of all money given is given by Americans to their houses of worship. And then that is distributed, and also most volunteer hours come from people in houses of worship. So that also has a massive influence on all of our cities.
So interesting.
Yeah, can I follow up a little bit about this? Yeah, thinking about the situation in China, I think for many years, the Chinese Communist authorities followed the Soviet Union model. You know, just religion should stay totally private, not in public. In recent years, at least some of the officials in the Communist Party or government began to say, you know, that's maybe too much, too harsh. So they are a little bit more open-minded, but they still think religion is not so good. It's better to, you know, keep at bay. So now they are switching from the Soviet model to the French model, the French laïcité, right? So the church is under the state, and the educational system should be, you know, under the state, not the church. So in China, still the government prohibit religious education, religious schools. But what's interesting is in recent years, there's a rapid rise of religious schools. You know, elementary, middle schools run by churches or by Christians, or by Confucian advocates, and maybe some Buddhist leaders also run those schools. So the formal regulations still prohibit that, but those formal regulations cannot be enforced. The movement from grassroots is just so strong as there's a rapid increase. Getting into education, getting into social service, charities, getting into the legal spheres, getting into politics.
So interesting.
Can I ask?
Yeah, go ahead.
So doesn't education have to be accredited, and couldn't they control it that way?
That's true. It's a huge challenge for people who send their kids to those religious schools, because that means they may not be able to enter the state education system. In other words, if you graduate from high school in a private school, you may not be able to participate in the national university entrance examination. But many of the Confucians, they don't care. They think society will change by then. And so now it's better to have Confucian moral education, because the public schools, they don't see the moral education element. And the Christians, many of them trying to connect with outside China, in the US or Hong Kong, they try to send their kids to those international schools or American schools.
So the university I'm at is a Christian-based university, and there are there's several hundred of them in the U.S., but we are directly tied to those schools that you're talking about in China, and they send students to us, yeah.
Talk a little bit about Buddhism, as you talked about spiritual but not religious, and some people in the U.S., and some of them think of themselves as having a Buddhist influence. This is sort of the impact of Buddhism has risen in the U.S. So maybe talk about, Buddhism in China versus the U.S. and just how they're different or similar, and how these two societies might have an impact on one another.
I would like you to start, because I'll tell you why. Because we were talking about this actually today in our conference, that religion never exists in some pure form. It's always embodied in a culture. So if you're going to talk about Buddhism, it's going to, by default, look different in China than in the U.S. So if we can get a sense of what it might look like in China, we can compare.
Buddhism practiced, the practice of Buddhism changing or moving around? What's the...
Yeah, so how does Buddhism, sort of Chinese Buddhism, have an impact on the U.S., and then maybe U.S. Buddhist ideas might have an impact on China in some ways as well?
Well, first, let me see the changes of Buddhism in China that was influenced by the West in general. Traditional Buddhism tend to be in the mountains, so the temples, monasteries in the mountains. They were not in the society, especially in later dynasties. They were not really engaged in society as out of the world practice. But then when China was forced to open to the West in the 19th century, and some of the Buddhists learned what's going on in the West. So they began to try to modernize Buddhism. That modernization is very much influenced by Europeans and Americans. So this modern practice of Buddhism, for example, the emphasis of Buddhist education, Buddhist academy, the idea is really learned like the seminaries. In the past, it's always the master-disciple relationship, rather than a formal school to educate those monks or nuns. And then the charities. Buddhists in the past, they did do a charity service, especially orphanage, but they didn't do the kind of charity programs. This is actually very recent. They started in the first half of the 20th century, but flourished in Taiwan. But the Taiwan Tzu Chi Buddhist charity organization, the leader explicitly said she learned that from the Catholics. Because the Catholics did what they did, so they learned to do it. So this Western influence to modern Buddhism, I think, is clear and multifaceted many ways. After the Chinese Buddhists came to the U.S., I did fieldworks here in Houston. What's surprising to see is a Buddhist temple installed pews and had a piano for the singing. Singing instead of the kind of chanting. Buddhist music traditionally, many of those are calm you down, right? But they are singing choir type of songs, make you excited, make you worship. So that's clearly influenced by Christianity.
Yep. Because of our history of not having a state religion in the U.S., the form of what we call congregationalism it's all-encompassing. So it isn't a place that you occasionally go, do a worship and leave. It becomes the place where you make your friends, meet your future spouse, get education, cultural center. The head clergy person becomes your counselor and your guide and helps you when you need your car fixed to figure out where to take it to. And it goes on and on and on. That is a
I need to
foreign.
start expecting more from
Yes,
my
you
pastors. They're
do.
supposed to be doing like car stuff.
Exactly. Well, you're paying their salary, right?
Paying their salary. I gotta get more out of this.
So that's exactly just as you were mentioning. What we see is that different non-Christian religions come here, but they adopt this congregational model and start copying it, partly because it's a great book, Becoming American by being Buddhist, by being Muslim, by being Hindu. You can practice any religion that's been a tradition in the U.S., but you have to follow a certain form, an American form. So they develop and they become cultural centers and places for education. And everything that I just said happens in temples and happens elsewhere. Now, here's what's interesting in the latest studies coming out, and there are some really good books on it. What happens back in the home country? These practices that become popular here start getting taken back. People are migrating back and forth. They're talking and telling them what they're doing here. So it's starting to flow globally.
That's really interesting. From both of your introductory remarks, it's clear that there is incredible religious pluralism in each society, more so than one would have thought, especially from your work, Fenggang, that's really path-breaking. There isn't any other work like it. So say a little bit about how religious pluralism, so the different types of religions, so multiple religious traditions in the same society, are handled in each society. How is religious pluralism handled in each society?
I would, now need to use the words more carefully. I think there's religious diversity in China, but whether that diversity is the same as pluralism, I would define this as two different things.
That's good.
There are plural religions in China. That has been the history. There were three major religions in traditional China. Then Islam came and Christianity came, so there are five major religions, plural. But there was no pluralism as how do you live a way to deal with people of the other religions. And pluralism is an ideology or philosophy. How do you live with people of different religions? I would say in China, there's still lack of it, a lack of pluralism, but there's a good diversity, plural.
So there's not a deliberate way to live together with different religious traditions. There's not deliberate reflection on that.
There are two aspects. First, the government policy is not a pluralism. It's, I call oligopoly, right? It's different from monopoly. In the West, in Europe, it used to be monopoly. One church is the state church. All the others are illegal, or at least not legal, right? It's a monopoly. China never had a monopoly most of the time, but it's oligopoly. There are 3, 4, or 5 are legal. The others to be suppressed. That's not pluralism. Pluralism needs to treat religions from the state perspective, treat religions more or less equally. It's not absolute, but need to treat them equally. And then for individuals, you would say, people of different religions have equal rights. You treat them equally. Then you have their freedom. They can choose between religions or among religions. I think many people in China still don't think that way. Believers of different religions in China, they rarely interact with each other because still the people who openly identify with religions still few. And it's really the communist government get the leaders of different religions come together, sit at the same table, but people laugh at that because that's very artificial, not natural. But increasingly, I think people began to realize they have to interact with people of different religions. Their own family members are becoming more religious in different religions. They need to learn how to live with that. Right now, I think it's just entering that stage. Pluralism is a new thing to learn for China, for Chinese people.
And in the U.S., is religious pluralism real, or
Right.
I'm going back to what you said before about religious traditions coming to the U.S. that are not Christianity and needing to adopt a Christian form, a congregational form.
Yeah. So at the state level, of course, it's all to be treated equal, and there have been some exceptions. Like if you were Mormon in the past and believed you could and should marry multiple women, the state said no, right? So there's been some limits to it, but mostly at that level, you're free to practice any religion. That's been a hallmark of the U.S. But exactly what you said, the reality is, and we have a colleague in Canada who's written on this, looking from afar, and said, it's a Christian nation no matter how diverse you may be religiously, because it's so overpowering, this influence, that it shapes all the other religions. Mm-hmm.
So let's think about politics for a minute. We want to sort of get it all out there. So thinking about the relationship between religion and politics in each national context. So our questioner says when Chinese men and women, for example, carry out forms of religious life, is this in essence a form of political resistance of sort? And then in the U.S., what is the relationship between religion and politics? Our questioner wants to know about, is this a violation of the supposed separation of church and state, right? There's tensions here that are interesting.
Yeah, China has been changing and swinging back and forth. Under Mao, the society was by definition totalitarianism. Anything not explicitly, anyone who not explicitly expressed their loyalty to Mao or the party would be considered resistance, right? But then, since the economic reforms that started in 1978 or 79, it loosened up. It's not demanded that way anymore. Yeah, you can do purely religious things, not talking about state affairs, then that would be considered fine, not interfering in politics. But then in recent years, under the new leadership, began to redefine the relationship back to the Mao time. Then anyone who does not comply to the government's requirements considered politically resistant, and began to have more troubles compared with 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So whether an issue is political or not is very much by definition. And like, for example, the underground Catholics and house church Protestants, by not joining the government-approved churches, and the government officials would say, oh, you're political. But many of them refuse to join, saying, if I join, that's political. But I want to be religious. I don't want to be political. So that's why I don't want to join the official church. So it's very contentious, a lot of misunderstandings, including many Christians, Buddhists, believers of religions. It's a very confusing definition, whether something is political or not political, and whether being political is good or bad. A lot of confusion.
Of course, in the U.S., we have this long-standing tension. Religion is private. You do it outside of the public sphere. It's not state-supported. So there's two beliefs, typically, and this is where the tension is. One is, as you enter into the public square, you are to leave that behind. And we're to have a secular discussion and use reason and use science and so on. The other is, I cannot check at the door who I am, so I must bring religion into the public square. And if we're going to have true religious freedom and pluralism, that's what we would want. We always in the U.S., we're uneasy about this as much as we celebrate that we're open to all religion. For example, as a state, we'll only sponsor non-religious schools. We'll pay for those, but if you want to have want a religious one, then you must raise those monies privately, whether you're talking about an elementary school or a university. Well, places like UK and elsewhere, true religious pluralism would mean the state will support all schools. If you want it to be a Muslim school, that can be supported, and so on. So it's a different approach. It's one we've never used here, but that's part of our tension.
So let me ask you just a couple more questions, one to each of you, and then we'll save a little bit of time for you all to be asking your questions. So please be formulating them now. Just be getting ready on the edge of your seats to ask your questions. So 2 questions. So I asked you to talk about religious change, but forecast the religious future. What do you think religion is going to look like from the work that you've done in each of these societies, in Chinese society and in American society in the US? What's it going to look like in 50 years?
So I
You
recently
heard it here.
Yeah. And of course, we're doing nothing but guessing, but I recently published a paper where what I'm trying to do is look at what is the effect of urbanism on religion, and using theories that are from urbanism, such as a subcultural theory of urbanism and some other works, can actually make predictions. And one of them, and some of these help me understand what the changes that we have seen. So one of the things that we would predict as we become more urban is that we will have more religious pluralism, because urban produces subcultures. The bigger the urban area, the more subcultures are produced. Not only because you're drawing from a wider place with more diverse people, but because people bump into each other and they do 2 things. They start learning from each other and create new subcultures, but at the same time, they learn, oh, there's people who think differently, we need to defend our subculture. So the defense becomes more intense. And that's part of what we're seeing in the US, the intensity of defending the differences and being very clear and defining, and why we're starting to see this really strong relationship between, if I am this religiously, I need to be this politically. That used to not be part of the definitions. It is now partly because of this growth of urbanism here, and it's of course happening in China. China became majority urban 90 years later than us, but it happened in about 2010. And wow, I mean, the cities there make our cities look tiny. But so that's part of it. And then, of course, social media produces the ability to have even more clarity and more ability to resist back and forth. So I see, I don't want to be pessimistic, but I see more conflict coming up.
Well, I want to start with saying sociologists tend not to predict what's going to happen. We try to refrain ourselves to only study what has happened, right? So that's empirical.
That would be history.
Right? But in the last few years, I have ventured into this projection based on what has happened recently, seeing if all factors hold constant and what would be the likely landscape in a few decades. And that's where I said by 2030, there will be more Christians in China than in the US. See, if we take a longer view, I think there will be increasing similarities between the US and China in terms of religion. There are several trends we can talk about. For China, it's the increase of Christians. For the US, the decrease of people identify with Christianity. In China, all religions are becoming more institutionalized. In the past, people don't like to identify with any religion. This is not only during the communist period. Traditional China don't like to, people don't like to identify with any religion. It's because traditionally the state played a big role suppressing organized religions. And so being spiritual but not religious is not a new thing to the Chinese. Right? It has been the way, that's the only way to survive, to be a religious person. But now increasingly more people want to have a religious identity. So it's going toward the US way. And then we see the US moving to the Chinese way. Increasing number of people say spiritual but not religious. And also another thing is, like what Robert Balla and his associate identified Shailaism. It's a new thing, Shailaism. Shaila is a person who said, you know, I have my own religion. I choose from different religions for my own. So my religion is Shailaism. And Robert Balla and his associate said in 1985, this is a big thing, this is new. But for the Chinese, why new? The Chinese folk religion is that way. It's called a folk religion. You take something from Buddhism, take something from Taoism, maybe even something from Christianity. Already there are, you know, statue of Jesus in some Buddhist temples. Right? So for them, this is nothing new. Shailaism has been the tradition. Another thing is like a New Age. At least in the 70s, 80s, 90s, that was a big thing. It's New Age to Americans. It's Old Age to the Chinese. So in so many ways, the rise of New Age, the rise of Shailaism, the rise of spiritual but not religious, if that continues, means American religion is moving toward the Chinese religion configuration. But the Chinese is moving toward the US way of being religious.
This has been really excellent, a lot of excellent content here. I'm sure that my fellow listeners have questions. So our procedure is to have some microphones, and do they walk to them, Haley? You walk to them, so maybe you walk down to the mic. Oh, thank you, brave soul, for getting up and leading the charge to walk to the mic. Thank you for that.
Good evening. Thank you so very much for this wonderful presentation. Just in light of today, Reverend Billy Graham passed away today. I think about his impact, his crusades, and his movement impacted civic life, humanitarian aid, all these different things. Could or does a type of spiritual figurehead like we had in America, could it exist in China?
That's a great question.
I think there are some religious leaders arising in China, in different religions, in Buddhism, in Christianity. There are leaders rising. Under the current Communist Party policy, it's hard for anyone to become such a figure with such a public influence. But things are changing. We don't know how long the current regime will hold on to the current system and whether there will be change. Actually, I would say there are likely change. The kind of change, it could be similar to the 4th century Roman Empire. If you know, the Roman Empire in the 4th century began with suppression. The great suppression of Christianity in 303 AD. But 10 years later, in 313, there was the Edict of Milan, granted freedom to Christians. Then, another several decades later, even took Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. And that's happened within a few decades. And with the kind of rise of Christianity in China, the rapid way, I think that could even happen in China.
So first of all, thank you for being here. That was remarkable. And I have a question for Dr. Yan. And so I think in China, some Buddhist practice has been very commercialized recently, as reported in the news. And some people became monks not because they truly believe in the religion, but because they think it's a good, well-paid profession. So I'm curious to learn about your opinions and thoughts on this.
And could I add, as you're responding, I was just reading today about there's Buddhist tourism. So Americans, people from all over the world will go to observe Buddhism, and it's become a business in a sense.
Yes, that has been a major problem in Buddhism, is the commercialization of Buddhism. It's partly driven by the policy. You can do tourism, but you cannot do religion. So many times religion has to be done in the name of tourism. And few people were used to donate to religion, but purchasing the religious artifacts or buying those incense sticks would be considered commercial activity rather than religious activity. So for 20 years, 30 years, they have done this. Many Buddhist temples got revived by being commercial. This is their successful experience. But now they realize this also corrupt, right? Market corrupt phase. And they began to realize this is a problem. They have been in a campaign to get rid of commercialization in Buddhism. But if it's already become so integrated in their organization, it's going to be very difficult to really achieve the goal of purifying Buddhism. A good example is a Shaolin Temple, right? Shaolin Temple became famous because of a successful Hong Kong movie. And when the movie was successful, attracted many tourists. It was barely, only a couple of structures standing, a few old monks remaining. It's dying. But when the tourism started, many tourists went there and paid the entrance fee, accumulated money, and began to reconstruct the buildings. Now it's a flourishing, huge compound. Then the local government and also residents see, oh, this is a good marketplace. So they began to further commercialize it, not for religion, but for material gain. So there are different players in this commercialization. I think many monks sincerely think they want to revive Buddhism pure. And they had no choice but to commercialize it. And then there are people who want to make money out of Buddhism pure too. So it's a dynamic thing, but it's changing.
Americans never do that. They never. That's never happened here. I don't know if you want to add anything, Michael, about that.
So I was going to just add, so if you're from here, you know Lakewood. And Lakewood has the most watched pastor in the world because of their worldwide network of television. I was deep in a cave in Montana being led by a park ranger, a woman, and somehow got out that at that time was living in Houston, and she said, "Oh, Lakewood, that's my church." And I said, "Do you live in Houston?" "Of course not. She lives in Montana, but she flies here once a month to go to her church because she sees her pastor every week on TV." So it's just a different type, but that's what happens, yeah.
That's great.
Good evening. I don't know if this, okay. I just had a couple of questions, and actually one for each of you, and then one is sort of a question comment. Dr. Emerson, I'm curious about what you talked about as it relates to kind of religion and politics and the ways that that is divided. And I kept thinking the term cognitive dissonance kept coming up as like there's this cycle of people that will give because we're charitable and we give to our churches for causes that actually have political solutions at times, but then might be supporting politics that don't actually shift the cause. So I'm just curious about your thoughts around that, how our religious and political beliefs can create that tension. And then I'm curious, Dr. Yang, I work with young adults and young adults of faith, which we know is not necessarily a booming population. So I'm curious about kind of the young adult movement as it relates to young people in China and religiosity or connection or practices of way of life, particularly for millennials and those that are under that or younger than that generation.
All right, so I wrote a book called Divided by Faith, and in that book, the whole purpose was to try to address what you just asked. And it was outlining in that particular case how a white evangelical subculture has developed separate from a black evangelical subculture. And in that subculture, it emphasizes a couple of things. I call them religio-cultural, social-cultural tools. Individualism, derived from my salvation comes through a direct relationship with Christ. And so that gets emphasized vertically too, right? Horizontally, right? That is, so if that's the relationship and that gives me salvation, then relationships matter deeply, one-on-one relationships. So solutions are one-on-one, not government. So what goes along with this strong individualism is what I call anti-structuralism, that government solutions, things at that level, and I interviewed people all over the country and they would all say the same, it's a facade, it's fake, it doesn't change the heart, it can't give us any answers. It has to happen through our individual giving, through getting to know, making friends, making connections. So, yeah, and that's part of why you start seeing these identifications with different parties, and partly because the parties know that these differences exist and they're trying to get their votes. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, about young people in China, if you're talking about those school-age children in China, because they're until recently it's only state education system, and in the state education system is atheist indoctrination. That is, atheism is taught as part of the curriculum. So young people, the vast majority of them are atheist by default. And those few who are religious is mostly influenced by their family. And also they have to hide that. In the last 30 years, 40 years, some period of lax, no one really enforcing atheism. So more and more young people began to participate in religious activities during summer vacation or winter break. But recently the government says, no, you cannot do this. Religious organizations cannot organize summer program or winter program for school-age children. On the other hand, younger people are freer than people of my age who were raised during really strong atheist indoctrination. Nowadays, atheism is more superficial. Young people were, I think those I interact about, including the Chinese students now attending college in the US. That's where I teach, right? And find that many of them are more open-minded to religion than older generation. So there are changes.
Mr. Emerson, you're talking about individualization and the anti-structuralism, and I agree with you. I think that's the trend that's happening for sure. Phyllis Tickle's book, The Great Emergence, also speaks of trends of every 500 years that's going through this kind of rummage sale of, do I really believe this? Do I not believe this? So I work in campus ministry as well, and one of my experiments is asking just straight up for an articulation of faith. I have a love-hate relationship with testimonies because there's so much drama that can be there. But I love them because it does make you articulate your faith in a society where you said earlier that we really don't talk about it. It's private. But that also means when we don't talk about it, we never really develop what we would say if we had to. So what I find is actually a lack of really true beliefs in things, and more like relationship stuff. So like you were saying, organized religion has been a social asset. It's been an emotional asset, a financial asset, of course. I wonder about what you think about the future, and I have hope, but the public sphere becoming diluted with so many platforms, like on social media and the internet. What are your ideas around that as far as an articulation of faith for the next generation in the future?
And maybe because you work with college age, right?
U of H, yeah.
Yeah, maybe you can tell me. So what we're seeing in the data is that, and again, I'll focus on evangelicals, but younger white evangelicals are more likely to say they care about things like justice, which was not what we had seen for a long time. Now, I'm not sure, do you see that or not? Not really.
Not really.
Yeah.
But, I
So
mean,
maybe they say it, but they don't know how to
Yeah, exactly.
actualize it.
Right, and obviously in college you're coming away from kind of just what your parents told you. I show up to church because my parents did, and we're starting to try and get into a flame where this is what I believe because I want to follow this way.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, there's kind of this like, not I wouldn't say tourism, but they are. I mean, so you're certainly exposed to a lot of different ways of life when you get to college. So.
Yep.
But I see you kind of gave the negative light of the future, having conflict and polarization. Absolutely, that's the dark side. But the positive side could be if we are having those one-on-one, person-to-person, like, what do you think? What do you think? Pluralism talks, like we dream, we hope for.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I don't know if you thought that was possible or what that would look like.
It is possible, and it will eventually happen. I think it'll get rockier before it gets better. And because of social media, it's the Wild West. We don't know how to control it. We don't know what the rules are. We know from psychology experiments that when we're removed from direct human contact in the way that social media removes us, we don't act as human with each other. Mm-hmm. And that's where we're caught right now. We're like, I mean, the amount of students now that feel like they're suffering from anxiety and trauma, and I think it's in no small part related to this. The vitriol that exists and the critique of how you look, and it's just endless. We'll eventually figure it out, just like we figured out things in the past. So we'll get there, but it'll take a little while.
Thank you very much.
Program on that next month, so I just.
Wow,
yeah,
perfect.
I know. That
You
was
planted
a great
him.
layup for that. Thank you. I hope you'll be back. Yeah.
I just have one question for Dr. Young. So thinking in a comparative sense between the US and China, in terms of Islam, like in the US, Islam has sort of stigmatized representation. It's it's a relatively small minority, but there are issues with Islamophobia and trying to associate a certain kinds of evil with Islam that's not usually applied to other minority religions. What is the representation of Islam in mainstream China? Like, just how is it represented similarly, or how?
Yeah, Islam in China is considered an ethnic minority. Actually, there are 10 ethnic minorities are considered Muslims. In China, it's a very odd thing. It's making Islam ethnicized. It's a modern project. This is even before the communist. Modern Chinese political cultural elites, they had a difficult time to how do you define Muslims, and both inside the Muslim communities and also outsiders. Eventually the solution is to ethnicize Islam. So in China, Islam is not a proselytizing religion. Unlike in the US, Muslims in the US try to convert people. In China, Islam is considered a family tradition. There are conversions, but only through marriage. And that's both a restriction to Islam, but also a benefit to Islam. Because in China, there's a Religious Affairs Bureau that try to restrict religion. There's also a ethnic minority bureau or commission that try to facilitate ethnic minorities. There are some similar affirmative action policy. You know, if you are an ethnic minority, like in the university entrance examination, you can get a few score added, a few points added. And in some government jobs, ethnic minorities get some points added. So very often in China, Muslims argue for their rights and benefits, not in the name of religion, but in the name of ethnic minority. And that has worked very well to the benefit of Muslims in China. One example, we have been doing mapping religious venues in China. There are a lot of mosques in China. Actually, by the state Census Bureau's data, maybe almost 40% of all religious sites are Muslim mosques. And in some areas of China, each village would have multiple mosques. And it's very hard to start a new church or a new temple. But it was relatively easy to start a new mosque for ethnic reason, not for religious reason. But in the last 2-3 years, there's a dramatic change because some of the people from those ethnic minority groups who are Communist Party members who are supposed to be atheists, but trying to suggest policies, actually even a bill was introduced to the People's Congress, that's Chinese legislature, and say we need to enforce, we should have a national law on halal food. And many people reacted, says, oh, are we getting Sharia law as the national law? And since then, on the internet, social media, there's a rapid rise of Islamophobia. So it's a reaction to that kind of approach. Suddenly awakened many people's fear of Islam in that sense. So there are interesting changes. In many ways, I would say, again, even the issue with Muslims and Islam are not that different between the US and China. It's really, in my presidential address, I even gave the title as China America. It's becoming one, or similar, China America as one word. And there may be another grand change around the world. I say Europe, perhaps, is very different from the US. The Muslims increasing fast, including institutionalization, much more so than the US.
Thank you both for being here. Looking at the research given in the pamphlets, I noticed that there seems to be kind of another example of China and US being opposites, where in the US, more education leads to less trust in religion, whereas more education in China leads to more trust in religion. I was wondering if you could kind of explain the reasons for those differences.
Do you have a sense for China?
I did a paper with someone in China on that topic. The more education, well, actually, the picture is it's a little bit more complicated than that. More education make many people more conscious of their whether they have religious beliefs or not, and so make more conscious decisions. Well, those who have less education, they simply do things, believe things without identifying that as religious. That's one aspect of it. Another thing is religion somehow in China, especially among those educated, always thinking religion is Christianity, Christianity is religion. So when they say they have more trust in religion, that tend to say more trust in Christianity. Now they're a little bit more on Buddhism, as religion is Buddhism, Buddhism is religion. So there's some definitional issue involved in that. It's not so much that the more educated, the more religious they are. I think it's just that they are more conscious of it. Actually, we started with a hypothesis of the opposite. Because of atheist education, the more education you get, the more atheism you're supposed to get, right? But we found it's not true. It's true that the more educated, the more likely to express trust in religion rather than the state. It's a strange thing, but yeah. Not good explanation, I know. It's just the beginning of serious research on this topic.
Did you want to say anything, Michael?
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that our research group through the Religion Public Life program has done some cross-national research that Fenggang has been an advisor for on scientists' attitudes towards religion. And we've been surprised among some of those scientists, even in fairly secular nations, that they don't blame their science for a decrease in religiosity, which has been kind of interesting, was a bit counterintuitive too. So,
And you also mentioned that in Taiwan, there are a higher proportion of Christians among scientists than in
the
the
general
society.
population.
Yeah.
So at this point, we are going to move on, I think, to our reception. And please don't run away. I'm looking at this room, and I know quite a lot of people in this room, but you don't all know each other. Some really cool people in this room. So we want to be embodied knowledge here. So we want to take the opportunity to really relate to one another. I'll let these two have the last word if there's anything else you want to say.
This is my last word. The United States is the third largest country in the world with population, 330 million people. China is the largest, 1,330,000,000 people. I mean, it's not even close. So we have to care deeply about what happens in China and India. Those two places have such a huge percentage of the Earth's population.
That's good.
We also have several Chinese scholars in the room who are visiting for another conference. So really want everyone here to get to know them. And we hope you'll stick around at least for a few minutes and try to just have a conversation with someone you didn't know before you came in. This is a rough night with rain and darkness. And these are the brave souls who braved this night. So thank you for being here, and come on out next month as well when we talk about religion and social media. Thank you so much, and please thank these two panelists.